How's that audio? Is that okay? All right. Thumbs up, not turn it up. All right. I'm really happy to be here. One of the reasons for me coming here, I've never had any academic visit here, and honestly, for a seismologist or geophysicist or earth scientist, this place is too big not to visit here or be aware of what's going on. It's been really exciting today, seeing the lab spaces, meeting with people. I'll be at UTIG tomorrow, but I'm really grateful for the opportunity to be down here. It's definitely worth the travel down. So just acknowledge collaborators, Akash Gupta, PhD student, Brian Chow, faculty at UAF, Walt Tape, Michael Brown, also Torsten and Chuan-Ming Liu on some of the more recent stuff who are here, funding from National Science Foundation, also the software that was mentioned there to get things going. I'm going to start a timer. For better or worse, I have never given a talk on this topic, so I'm excited to try this out here with you all. All right, so got the timer in case I have to cut things short. Outline 6 parts. We're going to have a motivation. I'm going to talk about elastic maps, symmetry, crystal symmetry. Don't fall asleep yet. Visualizing these. Also applications. We'll look at Alaska as a natural laboratory, and then I'll kind of sink into what I do, which is more computational seismology, but you'll see I'm venturing a ways outside of that realm. All right. So earth materials and important manufactured materials, alloys, for example, are anisotropic. Seismic waves, they travel through different speeds depending on the direction the wave goes through them. It sounds kind of earth sciencey, but when you think about materials, you could also think about the performance of a material, like a beam in a building. You know, that is talking about the property, the elastic properties of that material. So there's a lot of relevance to this field. Estimating the elastic material, a material's elasticity in the laboratory or in the field is achieved by combining some measurements, like seismic waveforms, with some kind of hypothesized parameterization of the material. In other words, some numbers that describe this elasticity. So this is complicated by sparse data coverage. We never have enough data for what we really want to image in the lab, or especially in the field. Spatial heterogeneity, things varying, computational challenges, how do we handle uncertainty in our measurements, and also interpreting and visualizing the results. So my talk will kind of slant on that last topic, but we'll move forward here. So I have a photograph here. That's a rock. Actually, it's the same rock that's on the table. So if you're interested, you can come up and check this out. It's a feldspar. It's very pretty. But it's also kind of a good motivated, good thinking rock. And what we'll see is when you look at this rock, we can start thinking about what's its shape, what's its symmetry, and you can come down and take a guess at, look at it afterwards and take your guess at what kind of symmetry this shape has. But this is a feldspar. It's one of the most common materials in the Earth's crust, and it'll be the focus of some of the results in this talk. So how do we measure the materials? I saw today in some labs how this is done in different places, but I like this one on the left. How do we measure how waves travel in different directions through a rock? Well, we take a rock and we turn it into a sphere, and we put sensors on the sides, and then we move the rock around. We make 100 different measurements. So that's actually how this group does it. They take a piece of granite, it's about the size of a baseball, and they make measurements by moving the sample around with stations, it's not stations, but sensors and receivers on different sides, kind of like medical imaging, where you can fully cover the sample and characterize the material. So there are other ways to do this. This is Mike Brown from a lab in the University of Washington. We have very small samples, just thin flecks from real rocks shown here at the left. Small samples, big lasers, powering ways to get at the elastic properties in a totally different way with the same kind of goal. So this, I'll just show sort of a schematic from one of these papers where there's a laser, 2 different laser beams coming into the sample, and the interference of that laser with the sample can give you the information you need to characterize the directional dependence of these waves. So the main point is measuring the elastic materials of samples that you put in the way. They can be small, they can be a baseball-sized chunk of rock. I saw a more sophisticated version of this lab already today, which was very cool. This has been done for a long time. This paper is from 1961 by Birch, looking at ultramafic rocks, various schists and gneisses. and looking at the fact that the compressional wave speed measured in the lab of these rocks is sometimes fast, sometimes slow, depending on the direction. So that's just intrinsically cool, that waves travel different speeds depending on the direction, but there's a lot more to these applications. So this is from 1960s. We've known for a while that these are properties of rocks and minerals. Going back to sort of looking at seismic waves at larger scales than the lab, in the 1960s, this is Hess. I know you can't read this from a paper in Nature in 1960. This is VP as a function of azimuth, the direction in the Pacific plate near Hawaii and Mendocino, showing that, again, there's this directional dependence. And so this is, along with the plate tectonic revolution, was information about anisotropy, and looking at the same time at sort of larger wavelength scales, like propagating in the earth from earthquakes. You have these globally recorded surface waves, and this is a well-known property that even in the 60s people were thinking about how we have anisotropy from different layers in the earth. And even in 1981, like our main reference one-dimensional or radially symmetric model of the earth has an anisotropic layer for the upper mantle. So this is entrenched that we know something about anisotropy. This is a sort of foundation for just bringing us up to what exactly we're talking about for anisotropy. So I'm going to go into elastic maps, symmetry, and crystal symmetry here, something about rocks, something about properties of rocks. Okay, an elastic map is something that takes a strain, we'll call it a 3x3 matrix, it inputs the strain and it outputs a stress. A linear map, it inputs something and it maps it to something else. You can think of it like any old run-of-the-mill function. It just happens to be handling 3x3 things instead of like a scalar or a vector. Input stress, strain, output stress. That's all it is, and that's kind of the building block for a lot of what I'll be talking about. So there won't be a ton of math in this, but I'll say that in order to represent a vector or a tensor, a linear transformation, we have to choose a basis. We have some sort of choice of our coordinate system. We could say x, y, z makes a lot of sense. Those should be probably perpendicular axes. Maybe we have units that are spaced out the same distance on each axis. Stuff you do automatically. In this case, the basis is 6 3x3 matrices, okay? So this is the basis for how we're going to represent a stress tensor, a strain, and also the elastic map that takes in a strain and outputs a stress. All we have to know is that this choice matters a little bit. We'll see why, but we'll see why. So if we look in a textbook and we say, what does it mean? What's an isotropic material? That means that in all directions the waves travel the same speed. And this has been, the map itself is a 6x6 symmetric matrix. That means there's 6 entries here, plus 5, plus 4, plus 3, plus 2, plus 1. There's 21 possible entries in that matrix. And for an isotropic material, there's actually 2 independent materials. There's one filling up these entries, one filling up these, and then these other ones are a combination of those. So most people, I wouldn't have been introduced this in like undergraduate, but we're just starting with the paint. We can understand what a 6x6 matrix is. It's got some entries that represents a type of material. If we choose this is the traditional form. If we choose this other basis, things look a little bit simpler. So this is what, if we choose that basis I just showed, we have that choice to be kind of clever about how we represent both our strains and stresses in these maps. We have 2 entries. The first 5 on the diagonal are the same, and then there's a 6th one. And so raise your hand if you've had linear algebra, just to get a sense. How many linear algebra? About like a third, something like that. Okay, so those of you who've had linear algebra, if you look at a diagonal, you're looking at the eigenvalues, which are some kind of intrinsic property of the material. I can change this basis however I want, and orthogonal-wise, and it's still intrinsic properties of the material. So what are those intrinsic properties of an isotropic material? Well, we would refer to them, this mu would be a shear modulus and a bulk modulus. So those are, how do we describe a solid? It's usually you hear different Young's modulus Poisson parameter. These are all just sort of different flavors of the same thing, but bulk modulus, shear modulus. It sounds a little bit like compression, VP and VS. So in the basis we chose, this is what the diagonal looks like. It's as we might hope for. The properties of this material, this elastic map, have something to do with the bulk modulus and the shear modulus. This would be what you'd find in a textbook chapter on anisotropy. It also has the bulk modulus and the shear modulus. It just looks a little, terms are combined, it's not diagonal. But the bottom term is the one we're going to be looking at. All right, so I'm going to just start. There's 8 kinds of elastic symmetry. There's 8. And each one can be effectively represented by a shape. So I'm going to turn this over to the audience. Someone's going to name a shape up there. That's the low, slow pitch. And then if you want to, you can name the symmetry class. I haven't told you what the symmetry classes are, but you could take a guess. So who feels like they want to name a shape and even name a symmetry class? I'm going to go students first here. Student, just roll the dice here. Name a shape, name a symmetry class. I don't think this is in the textbook, but maybe it should be. Sphere, all right. We got a sphere. Half credit. Would you like the bonus round? What symmetry class? Would anyone like to pass? Or?
I'll pass on that.
Okay. All right. Sphere. What's that? Cylinder. Okay, we got the shapes.
Is the sphere just like totally isotropic?
Isotropic. Did you say totally?
Or isotropic.
Isotropic. There we go. I think we have enough right answers there. Anyone want to throw another one? What was cylinder? Cylinder is kind of tricky for what the class is. Yeah. What do you call it? Semi-isotropic? Yeah. Yeah. Anyone want to fill in that word? Whoa, now we're all over the place. We'll go semi. Transverse isotropic. You're saying the same thing. Two-dimensional. It's the same all in one direction, same in the axes. So we're just going to fill in the blank here. There's one takeaway. If you could remember from this talk, it'd probably be like this kind of picture. I think this is a helpful guide. There's 8 classes. There's only 7 pictures here. The last one is any irregular shape will do. That's called trivial symmetry. Means basically no symmetry. So any shape will do that's not one of these. You could take like this thing right here would be, this would be our shape we're going to use for trivial symmetry. Not the pencil. This thing would be our trivial symmetry. So you've got from isotropic sphere. We'll start over here. You got a wedge with the monoclinic axis. That's a twofold symmetry. If we rotate about 180 degrees, that's called a twofold symmetry. We've got trigonal, a triangular prism. I just named these like a block where each face is a different area. A brick where the 2 faces would be the same. A cube, cylinder, sphere, and this is it. So there's monoclinic, trigonal, orthorhombic. Someone said tetragonal. These are the symmetry classes. It looks kind of obvious up here, but turns out this is a really hard problem. It's a hard problem, and you'll see a little bit why there. But this is what we have to work with. That means that when we measure elastic anisotropy in the lab, it's kind of cool to think that you basically have a drop-down menu. I've got 8 options. You could have all kinds of problems with your measurements, but in the end, if you're interpreting the elastic property, those are the choices you have. All right, so a little more on the picture there. We have our classes shown up here. We can take these, and if we look at the shapes, I'm going to do something to the shapes. I'm going to put these dots on them. Those dots are twofold axes. If I draw a line through there and I rotate by 180 degrees, I get the same shape. That's what that means. So if I take, you can think about that, just put your finger on that shape, rotate it 180 degrees, it's the same shape. And it turns out that that is the key piece for trying to determine what the symmetry is of a material. So monoclinic has 1 twofold axis, orthorhombic has 3 twofold axes. The red dot is a 3-fold axis. It doesn't really matter, but it kind of helps to think about 3-fold axes sometimes. And so on the edge of the triangle and in the center of the face, you've got 2-fold axes. So that gives us kind of an idea. And if you're transverse isotropic, every single point, every single thing going around could be a twofold axis. We could take any direction, flip that cylinder, and it would still be the same cylinder. So that's why it looks like a band. Isotropic is all blue because you can go in any direction with your isotropic material, rotate it, it's still the same thing. That's why the whole thing is painted blue. So we can look at this on the sphere and we'll see why. This is just showing where these dots are on the sphere. And that's the essence of some of what we'll be looking at. Why we can visualize some of these maps is because by knowing what this blue thing is called the zero contour. We'll see what it's a zero contour of, but the pattern of dots, or this line, there's only 8 possibilities, going from nothing on the left to everything on the right, isotropic, and in between we have these cool cases. On the bottom shows what the reference form of these matrices look like. This elastic map, it's a transformation. Once we pick some sort of coordinate system, it becomes a 6x6 matrix. All of these entries here would be zeros, and everything on it's symmetric, so everything on the upper right is the same as on the lower left. This was the isotropic one that I introduced. It's very simple. It has 2 parameters. You might be used to thinking of like VP and VS, or it could be bulk modulus and shear modulus, 2 parameters. And over on the far left, you have 21 parameters. So that's our starting point for elastic symmetry. Don't read this too carefully, but if you took, how many of you have had mineralogy or some exposure to mineralogy? About the same. Okay, so now is your turn, or maybe both of you, but there are 32 crystallographic classes. It's been known since 1830. There's 32. It's not empirical. It's a mathematical outcome. Also a hard problem, but turns out not as hard as the elastic problem, which wasn't really figured out until the 1990s. Okay, so here's a comment from a paper by Forte and Vianello about elasticity. All pioneering papers on anisotropic linear elasticity took for granted, presumably for physical reasons, that symmetries of elasticity tensors should be looked for within the set of crystal classes. Okay, we'll see where this confusion leads to. So this is a picture from a widely used textbook, 1957, republished in 1985, listing these elastic symmetry classes. It implies there's 10, and it associates crystallographic classes with elastic classes. So this it's hard to read, but like 4 bar, 4 over M. These are the crystal classes. They're kind of associated with this elastic class. So we see that there's 10 listed, and there's also this association between crystal and not. If you look at a 2015 review paper, it's kind of similar. So there's 10 classes listed. The crystal classes are listed in association again. So if you're starting new, you would go to something like Treatise on Geophysics, or maybe this 2017 review paper, and it would be a little confusing. You may not realize that it's confusing, but it is confusing because there's not actually 10, there's 8, first of all, and there is no association between crystallographic symmetry classes and elasticity. And so that's something I frame in this next slide, which, well, sorry, let me go back to here and say, we can say, well, there's 8 classes, where would they line up if we had to mathematically like aim them at a crystallographic class? And we could do that. We could find, there's actually 6 here that would fit, there's 2 that don't belong. We could kind of make this connection, but I'll come back to why that's a little bit dangerous. Here's the sort of way I look at it, that there's these 32 crystallographic classes, there's 8 elastic symmetry classes. There's our Venn diagram. There's 6 that have something in common. There's basically 26, I won't do the footnote here, that aren't connected, and there's 2 elastic symmetry classes that don't match any crystallographic class. So one of the goals here is let's try not to confuse this crystallographic side with the elastic. It's very tempting. You can see how. Well, if I'm looking at this crystal, and I know it's crystallographic symmetry, maybe I would guess if I measured in the lab its elastic properties, maybe it's got the same thing. But that's just an idea. That's a hypothesis that hasn't actually, I would say, been fully tested at the level that I think would be warranted. So here's some points of this here. We can see crystallographic symmetry. It's right there. You can see it in crystals. You can see it there are 32 possibilities. We can't see elastic symmetry. We have to estimate it based on measurements from the lab. And there are 8 possibilities. Just to say there should be no assumption about crystallographic symmetry related to elastic symmetry. That could be a hypothesis, but it shouldn't be assumed. So we can see elastic symmetry by visualizing our estimated elastic maps. And so that's where I'm going. So we'll shift gears, visualizing elastic maps. We're like, well, we were looking at some 6x6 symmetric matrix with 21 numbers. How are we going to visualize that and all possible things that could occur there? Well, this is the picture. So this is a picture of an elastic map with 21 parameters. In general, we have 21 parameters. Somehow I'm here to tell you that we can plot this thing on a sphere with contours. But I feel like, hopefully you can see that's a sphere. It's got 3 axes. It's oriented. There's some color that we're going to learn. But I'm going to advocate there's a good way to visualize your result, whatever your elastic map is. This is a feldspar from a publication, 2016, by Mike Brown. And actually a carefully oriented sample from the lab, carefully measured elastic materials. And what this is showing is it is showing the, in any given direction, we are looking at the closest possible material that has a twofold axis, a monoclinic material in that particular direction. So if you're standing in the center of this sphere, you're looking at every possible direction and you're asking, what's the closest material that is monoclinic to me? And this gives you a picture of where the closer you go to the 0, the closer you are to finding that material. So there's some math going on here, but the outcome is something that we can try to interpret. As I talked about, those blue dots telling us what kind of symmetry is. So the 0 contour, the darkest blue part, will determine the symmetry of the material. In this picture, do you see the darkest blue? No. You see some blue? You see the color scale? You can't see the whole picture. There is no dark blue in this material, and that means if there's no blue dot, that means it's trivial. That means it has no elastic symmetry. And so I just put in here feldspar, very ordinary material with an extraordinary elasticity. It's pretty complicated. So this gives a picture, a tool for visualizing. We could look and just stare at numbers with 21 parameters, but I'll hopefully convey that you can get a lot more out of this by looking at this kind of representation. So maybe we don't fully trust our measurements. That goes for pretty much every scientist should probably not fully trust their measurements. But we have a lot of measurements, we're not exactly sure, and we say, I measured this feldspar, but maybe it's not, elastic symmetry with no symmetry. Maybe there is some symmetry here, because it kind of gets close to 0. It's, gets down into the blues. Is that a place where this material might have some different symmetry? It's even got blue patches in suspiciously kind of close to the axes places that might suggest a different kind of symmetry. So that's a kind of practical question that might be asked. So what's shown on the top, this is the material. And if it feels esoteric, you can just think of this as that's a feldspar. That's what it is. It's a lab measurement. That's the centerpiece of the study, is the properties of feldspar. And so that's exactly what it would look like. This shows the closest monoclinic, so like a higher symmetry version of that material, and this shows the closest orthorhombic version. And so what that means in this picture, to circle back to the beginning, that means that if this is monoclinic, there's got to be one blue dot, technically 2 blue dots. The axes would go right through, but you see where this yellow arrow is? That means there's a 0 contour. So this is the closest material to this one that has monoclinic symmetry. And so would you agree that these balls or spheres look kind of similar to each other? I'm saying that there's something very special about each of these. These have the symmetry of an orthorhombic material. This is monoclinic. But, the main sanity check is that if you were looking at the matrix entries, you may have some idea, but you don't, your brain is wired to compare, I would say, pictures like this rather than numbers. You know, throwing a negative number in one of these matrices, your brain doesn't throw a red flag at that or say, oh, is there a negative eigenvalue? You know, your brain looks at this and say, these seem plausibly similar to each other. And so this shows that these axes right here, this green dot, this green is to highlight the zero contours. So there's a blue, solid blue dot here, and this shows you that there's 1, 2, and there's another one right here. That shows that there's these 3 axes, which would be 6 dots on the sphere. That shows this is an orthorhombic material. And so maybe if we made these measurements, but we were actually saying, well, I'm a little unsure about my measurements. Maybe this material I'm looking at has higher symmetry than my measurements suggest. This is the kind of decision that you'd be faced with, and that would depend on the uncertainties in your measurements. Just to show a little bit better that what we're looking at, I can take the balls at the top and I can rotate them so we're like looking down some preferred direction. And so if you look down this yellow axis right here at the center, you see that it's dark blue. I've removed the yellow arrow so you can see that it's blue right there. So hopefully everyone can say, if you're looking right at the center, why this would be a two-fold axis. If I look down there, just look at it, and I took it and I rotated at 180 degrees, this little red patch would go right here. This little patch right here would rotate over here. Do you see how that's a two-fold symmetry? So that's what it means to be, that'd be like what you could think of that as the wedge shape, that looking down that in any direction I can rotate it by 180 degrees. If you look at that same orientation of the original material, you see how that's not a two-fold axis. For starters, you don't have the dark blue at the center, and you also look at this patch right here. You know, so that patch, if I rotate it by 180 degrees, is over here. It's just not. That does not have any symmetry. Similarly, looking down the orth, you can see a little more better picture that this would be also a two-fold axis. It's getting some idea of how to work with this materials. More commonly in this field, we care about velocities because we're measuring velocities of how waves travel through the material. So you can take the material shown here, and you can also look at what the predictions of 3 velocities, what are called Christoffel velocities, would look like as a function of direction. So if these angles these are the angles between these two elastic maps, like you'd have an angle between 2 vectors, it's the same idea. But over here you can see these are in maybe more familiar units, kilometers per second. So these would be, you can think roughly of these as S waves, but honestly at this kind of material, it starts to get a little bit odd about what kind of waves are actually propagating, but this would be the fastest wave of how the variations in the material would be fastest in this direction, slower in this direction. This is showing you the actual directional dependence of these 3 waves as traversing through feldspar. And so if you look in, for example, well, let's see, you can also look at, in this case, this is the main material, this is the closest orthorhombic material. You can look at the velocities for these. One of the main differences is that these are complementary. If you're making measurements, it's very nice to see what the predictions of your material would look like for comparison. If you're trying to determine what kind of symmetry the material has, then you're going to be better off on the left here, because all you have to do is find where these zero contours are, and they'll tell you what type of material is, whereas this would be harder to make that determination. I don't see how you could make it directly. You could make some inferences. If you look at the original, there's different ways to visualize this. The original paper, this is showing you if I cut through the material and I looked in, map view or 3 different planes, how fast things would travel. These contours are in 2 kilometers per second each one. So if you had a dashed line, would mean that the sort of isotropic equivalent would be that the waves are traveling the same 6.7 kilometers per second in all directions. The S wave is traveling about 4. And if you look at the actual material in these planes, you have these surfaces that show you how strongly varying the velocity is in different directions. It's very strong, at least in terms of what you would find in most sort of field experiments or regional seismology. But in the lab, you can find materials very common materials with very strong properties. So these would be the kind of figures that you might see in this paper, but I just wanted to show the sort of origin that you're taking a slice around the equator of this, and then you're combining these three curves to make something like a lot of different ways to visualize this. All right, I think in the interest of time, I'm going to skip this. I'm going to keep going, but to take this step further, we can look at the material, which is at the bottom, and we can find the closest equivalent version in each of these symmetry classes. So this is this feldspar, and this is the monoclinic, this is tetragonal, orthorhombic. We can look at there's an equivalent map, and I guess the practical question we can get at is, what's the consequence of assuming a higher level of symmetry when estimating the elastic properties? Most of seismology is operating right up here. In fact, most of it's right here. We just assume something's isotropic. But even in the lab, you're apt to measure full parameters if you can, but you're asking the question, do I really believe that this material has no symmetry? Or maybe this is pretty close to here. Like, how close? Is that close enough to assign this and say, well, this material I'm going to publish on this rock, this granite, this material is tetragonal, has tetragonal symmetry. Well, to make that statement, you need to know about the uncertainties in your measurement, and I would argue you'd really benefit from this kind of visual representation to provide a sanity check. Okay, applications to published studies. This is back to the lab, the laser lab from Mike Brown, where I was like, what exactly are you looking at? And he shows me these flecks of rock that are really small. I was kind of hoping that he was putting something like this into, I don't know what kind of a beam, but it's a pretty small piece of rock, and I can understand after seeing the experiment why it has to be small. You got lasers shining through there, but collects interesting rocks, posing interesting questions, and this shows the laser that was used in those experiments. So here's an example where I take some published results, and what it does is there were 8 feldspars, and each one had a different amount of percent anorthite. So some kind of anorthite albite spectrum here, and measured the elastic materials with uncertainties. And there's a lot of information here, but what is being shown, and this is sort of my analysis of his published results, but they're asking, well, what are the trends in elasticity of feldspar as the amount of anorthite changes? So I'm changing the composition. It starts getting at the questions of what exactly is the connection between composition, the lattice, and how this material performs under stress. So here what you see is that the bottom line, these show how far the material is from being monoclinic. So the fact that the black line here and the degrees is just the angular measure between your starting material and the closest monoclinic material. So this shows the fact that the black line is not at 0 tells you this material is not monoclinic because it's a certain distance away from monoclinic, and there are uncertainties there that provide that. So this material has no symmetry, but we might ask the question of like, well, how do the trends change? Or if I look at the bulk distance from being isotropic, which is quite large here, we see that this trend goes downward, and even down here there's some trends going upward. Even Mike, when I talk to him and even looking at this, we don't have a great explanation for what the trends are, but we are in agreement that having this kind of information can pull your data set together and give you a starting point to think about things, and it can also prevent you from making some statements. For example, regarding trends, you can look at your results and say, oh, this material, there's no trend in increasing aluminum with these amphiboles as a function of the symmetry. And you can look here and see that there's only 2, maybe 3 data points. They're downward trends, but I mean, if you believe the uncertainties, there is some kind of trend here with increasing aluminum. So one study was about feldspars, the other study was about amphiboles, and by looking at these, by taking this representation, we can get an idea of really getting at, if you're asking what is the elastic symmetry, we can start to get some idea of the properties of these samples that differ from the presentation in these papers. So this is where the authors have set up the sort of experiment and the thing that's being varied, but we also keep in mind that the elastic properties are also going to depend on other factors, not just the aluminum content or the anorthite percentage. Back to the sort of more tractable experiments where we say, rather than look at a crystal, let's look at a rock. And I like this opening line of this abstract. Westerly granite, this is Westerly, Connecticut. In rock mechanics, I guess this is a well-known quarry or material that a lot of people use, has been generally accepted as an isotropic, homogeneous rock. I like that because these authors are saying, is it? Let's just see. And I really like this approach that says, let's not assume anything. Let's take a material, take a feldspar, take a garnet, take whatever, and don't assume anything about the symmetry. Let's measure it. And so they set up, there's also there's a gneiss and another granite, set up these tennis ball size samples, measure velocities of the material through 130 or so different directions, and really see what the directional dependence is. And what they were interested in is, here's granite, two different granites, a gneiss, and they're interested in what are the effects of temperature on these materials and changes in pressure on these materials, but also just in general, what's the elasticity, what's the elastic symmetry of the material. And just from that point, which is a conclusion in their abstract, I would say that given the information shown here, you would have a different conclusion than the one in the paper. Not a hugely different conclusion, but in order to quantify, to make that statement, this granite has transverse isotropic symmetry, you need to be able to represent your information somewhere close to like this, but you also really need measurement uncertainties. You need error bars on these in order to decide whether a material is close enough to some symmetry to say, yeah, this granite seems to have tetragonal symmetry. And you have to have some idea of what it means to be a certain angular distance away from where you started. So this is a way to I think, at very low cost, there's not much going on to these computations and visualization. You can provide a tool to benefit these pretty fundamental studies going after what are standard materials, amphiboles, which were monoclinic there, and then the feldspars, which have no symmetry. And at a larger scale, one extension of this is from one of the connections that brought me to asked to work with Torsten Becker here, is looking at subduction flow models, where the sort of state of the art over the last 15 years or so is that through a combination of computational rheology tools, these three-dimensional models can provide a prediction of what the elastic map is at each point everywhere in the Earth. And there's other information that kind of goes into that. It could be plate kinematics, could be even tomography models, but it's a realistic picture of flow, and we can take those global models and we can also look at, well, how far is each of these 12,000 points in the model, how far are they away from being transverse isotropic or isotropic? And this just shows an example of one of these pictures. So this shows, I believe it's at 200 kilometers depth, it shows how far from being transverse isotropic is each of the materials in this provided in this 2008-2014 flow model. So a subtle point but important one here is when you look at this and it says 0, that doesn't mean that the material is transversely isotropic. It's either transversely isotropic or isotropic. So if you want to make the assignment of which class it's most likely to be in, you have to have some sort of a threshold to say, well, if I'm below a certain value of this angle, I'm going to call that in the symmetry class, otherwise I'm going to consider a higher symmetry. And that choice allows us to assign each point to the symmetry class. So in here, the red would be the isotropic materials from this model. The This grayish ones here would be the transverse isotropic materials, or greenish, and the purple ones would be tetragonal. I think actually the color scale, if I'm not mistaken, no, tetragonal is there, that's the blue, it's orthorhombic. So there's very few tetragonal options in here. But that's how another way we can take this information and just possibly provide something that would be useful in interpretation. Okay, going on to Alaska, this is going to be a bit of a whirlwind sort of talking point. So if there's anything of interest, you could follow up with me by email, or I'll be at UTIG tomorrow, or you can come up and talk to me afterwards. I'm not going to be able to go into a lot of detail here, but I want to introduce what Alaska has to offer, some of my motivating ideas or studies. One of them was a 1990 study looking at southern Alaska on this grand two-dimensional transect of Alaska active source line. This is Alaska right here. This is the inset map. This is the Richardson Highway. That's where the pipeline is. And this shows a zoom in on the area. And so there's two things. They have rocks that are exhumed at the surface. They can measure the anisotropy of those. They also have an active source experiment where they can look at the kind of directional dependence, and under the assumption that they have some sort of fabric that's tilted. So instead of saying I've got some layered material, in this case they're assuming it's some sort of foliation in a metamorphic terrain, that it is tilted, and as a function of direction you expect the acoustic velocity to vary, in this case between 5 and 6 kilometers per second. And there's a few sparse data points in here, but that's the motivation. You've got rocks, you've got an active source experiment to look at. And this remains still debated about what the origin of anisotropy is in the crust, but this is a figure from their paper. They were kind of poking the bear. This led to a comment and reply by stating, not supported by our data. This is the sort of opening cracks in the crust, and this one is supported by our data, but this is the kind of decision-making in the interpretation realm. Once the anisotropy is characterized, you still have the challenge of, well, why? What exactly about the material is causing this anisotropy? And that has not been a central part of this talk, but that's an extremely important question as they're trying to go after here. There's a lot of earthquakes in Alaska. I just showed this map. This is just 1 year. Every year looks kind of similar. There's always a different story here and there, but this is where Fairbanks is, right in the center. And if we look, this line shows the slab seismicity below 100 kilometers. And what was exciting going back there to work and be a seismologist was the idea that you have like a lot of earthquakes right below you, excitation coming up from below. So if you want to image something like the mantle wedge, you can't do it in Cascadia like you can do it in Alaska because you don't have that kind of earthquake production. You can do other techniques. I mean, there's a lot of techniques to go after, but in terms of just let's use earthquakes as sources to illuminate, you basically have a lot of opportunities here. And so that's what one of these studies on local shear wave splitting was about. This is another motivating slide. This is from Japan, where if you look at these are earthquakes in the slab, and these are shear waves that have a fast direction that abruptly change from being parallel to the arc to perpendicular to the arc. I mean, I don't know about you, but if I see a data set like this, it feels like, I mean, assuming it's all correct and valid, that is a dramatic pattern that probably, there's some truth to this notion of anisotropic structures that are in between the slab and the surface. There are other waves that we'll look at propagating all over the earth, these SKS waves, but these are ones right between the slabs. So whatever's happening to cause this is in that subduction zone. And this shows southern Alaska where, there's a lot of data here, but hopefully if you look at a rose diagram or your eye is drawn to a general alignment right here, and then if we go into this region further, a little further out from the wedge, you see in general this direction. So it goes from this direction to this direction, similar to this Japan case. It's very exciting. You have a master's student who, I can't guarantee that things are going to work, but at least when we saw this, it's like, well, this is something that's at least appealing to talk and think about. It could have been a complete shotgun, and that would still be a story, but here this seems to have some connection to the wedge. So this is the wedge. By wedge, it's that little triangle where the downgoing plate is sort of proposed to have some anisotropic properties. This is just a 3D picture of interpreting the pattern that may arise from the oceanic lithosphere, potentially flow in the back arc, and also fabric associated with the wedge. At the greater scale, Alaska, I mean, basically there were a series of experiments where people put out temporary deployments prior to Earthscope stations going up there. And one of the main targets was looking at shear wave splitting. So this is something to do, these are distant waves coming in and being influenced by structure that is underneath the station and giving some idea of anisotropic structure. These are these fast directions. And if you look here, there's quite an abrupt change. So right here, see if I thought I could, there we go. Right here, you see they're kind of going they're going perpendicular to the trench, and then they abruptly change to parallel. So again, that's a really sharp change that, I mean, surface wave tomography, this is a great thing about shear wave splitting. You can get a pretty localized abrupt changes, and the Earth probably has a lot of localized abrupt changes that we are often smoothing out as seismologists, but this is probably a case where things are pretty sharp, and you can see that. And this is a more after sort of 3 renditions and a lot more data, getting a picture of what shear wave splitting shows in Alaska. This shows absolute plate velocity vectors and this sort of northern Alaska picture where hopefully you can see these are not randomly oriented lines. They have length that are related to the time and the direction, giving some idea there too. So this is a picture that there are anisotropic features underneath Alaska. I'll skip that. From the geologist side, I'll just show a picture that has one of the best, exhumed mantle arc rock exposures in the world. And this is showing an area also off the Richardson Highway. Remarkably, you can walk to this place. So much geology in Alaska, requires a helicopter or just a lot of perseverance to get to the place. But this place you can walk to. And what it shows, this is the scale here. This is 1 kilometer right here. This is just a couple kilometers. And over this scale, you have the moho. You're like, what are you talking about, the moho? That's an old moho that is at the surface, the contact between the mantle and the lower crust. And so there's a few parts in the world where you can see the complete sequence of rocks passing through the lower crust and into the upper mantle. And so this study, they sampled these rocks, they looked at them in the lab, they measured electron backscatter diffraction, they could measure the anisotropy of those materials. So they're like going to the mantle right here and making those measurements on rocks. So that's kind of one of these exceptional places where you can tackle these problems. This is a paper motivating the sort of subduction dynamics from Margaret Jadamick and Magali Billen in Nature, where this is looking south. So this is the subduction zone coming at you. So if you're looking from northern Alaska to the south, you'd see a slab coming at you. There's this over-thickened Yakutat crust, which is essentially, cornerstone sort of finding and target from a huge project led out of here, the STEEP project. And if we look here at different profiles, this is mainly to motivate that there's going to be predictions here based on how the mantle should flow, and there are predictions that you could potentially ask, does the shear wave splitting data consistent with the predictions from the rheology or viscosity assumed in these models? I'm going to skip that. I'm going to skip that one too. This is just getting toward a similar looking picture, but this is derived from after the Earthscope stations came out and we had ability to cover northern and western Alaska. This is, California easily fits right here in western Alaska, just a sense of scale of how big, and there have been no station in western Alaska, so a lot of coverage led to new discoveries, and this is showing one of these predictions of the shear wave splitting, the fast directions derived from surface waves. So these are seismic surface waves, but again, getting at some prediction of how, it's actually kind of consistent with this subduction flow model, that there's this huge colliding over-thickened crust that's impacting the flow of the mantle. So this is where sort of getting toward the cutting edge of what seismic imaging of anisotropy is looking at in Alaska. And I'm going to finish here with a look at kind of what I'm doing in our group to tackle these problems. First is I'm a computational seismologist, so I'm interested in how waves propagate in materials. The tools we use are called SpecFem. It's 25 years old now. This paper is from 2000 and is still a pretty cool study when you look at all the details, but this just shows how waves propagate in an isotropic material on the right, on an interface with not that strongly as some kind of zinc material on the left, just giving you an idea of the complexity of waves that are flying around in these. Even a homogeneous material, there's going to be a lot of complexity. So one advantage is that these solvers can easily accommodate this complexity. So as compared with a finite difference solver, for example. I'll just say motivation is that people have looked at, with numerical solvers, I can make a little change to the Earth's anisotropy. I can look at how that changes seismograms. It's like in this case, the P waves are strongly affected by this change in anisotropy, but these S waves look just fine. So you can use these things as a tool to say, well, where should I be looking in the data? Or if I look in the data, where should I be cautious about my assumptions of the anisotropy? So there's the forward modeling side, and then there's also, I can say, if I want to make a measurement of a certain wave, I can actually directly ask what material in my medium, like what elastic parameter, which of those 21 is that measurement sensitive to? So that's a super powerful way to turn this problem and say, well, if my end game is to try to image the properties of the Earth, I need to know the link between a wiggle on the seismogram and some change at some place inside the Earth. That's kind of what seismic imaging is set up as. This is just extending that to have a lot more allowable parameters in the space. This is a paper that is a real motivating paper for us. It's an extensive study doing these kinds of synthetic experiments. We're looking at trying to do some aspects and build upon this. I just wanted to acknowledge, I sort of consider this state of the art in trying to recover complex inclusions or materials that are in Earth's subsurface. This is synthetic. It's not real data, but if we can't do a synthetic experiment, it's probably not even worth trying with the real data set. So that's where we are, as we're trying some of these numerical experiments. You can put your stations in circles. I'm going to kind of, so you have a bunch of stations, you run simulations in two models. One, don't worry about the details. One is an isotropic model, and the other is some kind of simple transverse isotropic model, and it could have a vertical axis like layered, or it could be tilted like this. And so you have a P wave and you have an S wave, and the difference between those two models is telling you something about the difference between your isotropic and the anisotropy. So if you look here, these are sorted by azimuth, going around a bunch of stations in a circle. You can kind of see an azimuthal trend and the difference in these time shifts. So a much more compact representation of this would be shown here, where this represents the material that's kind of oriented like this, and we tilt it 30, 60, 90 degrees, and we can get these simulation results that look kind of similar like what was shown in that geology paper. So it's kind of cool that, strict geology paper, pretty distant computational seismology, but there are basic overlaps of trying to just check that your whole setup is working about as well as you could check before you go to something more complicated. I wanted to give a shout out here looking at where we're headed in Alaska. This is a sequence of papers looking at Alaska from Ritzwaller, Chong-Ming, who's a postdoc here, 2019, looking at this sort of, I got this should be VTI, HTI, basically increasing complexity of anisotropy, where you have a layered model with axis like this. We didn't do tomography in Alaska. Now we're going to look at some sort of azimuthal variations with the axis and the horizontal plane, and then just this year we published, well, let's just take the general case where this axis can be tilted and start to ask the question, well, yeah, if there's really a chunk of Kula plate that's dipped down or oceanic crust, if it's really tilted like that, seismology should be able to see these fabrics and be able to identify that it has a tilt to it. And we're not going to be able to do that if we assume that the anisotropy is either vertically oriented or horizontally. So this is an exciting realm, which is one reason why we're kind of, it just so happens that this model is tied to Alaska here. I've got to wrap up. I'm at 54 minutes, so I'm going to say we're running simulations in these complex models. We've just started, and SpecFem software is open to anyone. All the tools we're showing for the forward solver, the kernels, the iterative inversion. You can go to specfem.org, check that out. And I also wanted to make a plug. The training for this particular tool, both of those, is accessible and available under the Scoped platform. Ian Wong is one of the PIs there. He's a seismologist, also very good with HPC. He works at TAC, and wanted to make a plug there. So I'm going to finish with just some perspectives. As I said, determining the elastic properties, it's a parameter estimation problem. All right, so we've got the space of unknown parameters. What I'm trying to get at is quite vast, especially when you consider spatial variations in those materials. It's not just a single crystal in the lab. So these are just some thoughts on making it easier, better data coverage, efficient measurements, as in what waveform is sensitive to which of these elastic parameters. Measurements with uncertainties are vital across all of the work we do, but especially in this realm. Formal treatment of regularization. This is a huge topic that touches, it's just a buzzword for a lot of different techniques that we can use to simplify this problem. And then also visualization of these spatial variations. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'll take